You did not arrive here by choice in the way the mind understands choice. Something in you moved first, long before curiosity, long before logic, long before you could explain why your attention paused here. That movement was resonance, and resonance always precedes awareness. This is how timelines begin to open, not with decision, but with a subtle internal shift that draws you toward a different current without announcing itself. Most people believe change starts when they decide to change. That belief alone is why they remain where they are. Reality does not respond to intention spoken from the surface, it responds to coherence forming underneath. You were pulled here because coherence already began to organize itself within you. The signal was sent before the mind had language for it. This is not dramatic, and that is precisely why it is so often missed. Timeline openings do not feel like explosions or breakthroughs. They feel like a quiet pause in the noise, a slight softening in the body, a moment where urgency loosens its grip. For most, that moment passes unnoticed because it does not match the mind's expectation of what important should feel like. The mind looks for effort, for instruction, for something to do, while the shift arrives as something to notice. When nothing demands attention, attention drifts back to habit, and the doorway closes without resistance. This is the danger that almost no one talks about. Not that people reject opportunity, but that they never recognize when it was present. The field offers openings constantly, but recognition is rare. Not because it is difficult, but because it is quiet. The old timeline does not fight to keep you. It simply waits for you to return your attention to it. And most do, automatically. You are inside one of those quiet openings now. Not because this video contains information you need, but because the state that brought you here is already different from the one that keeps people looping. If you treat this moment like content to consume, it will dissolve like all the others. If you treat it like a pause to fill with thought, it will fade just as easily. The only thing that allows a timeline to stabilize is presence without interference. This is not about believing anything new. It is about noticing what is already happening. There is a subtle settling that occurs when alignment is present, a feeling of things lining up without effort, without strain. That settling is the doorway. The longer you remain without rushing to label it, fix it, or use it, the more it reveals itself. Recognition does not arrive through force. It arrives through stillness. Most people are trained to move past moments like this because they appear unproductive. Nothing seems to be happening. And yet, everything is happening underneath. The field is responsive in ways the mind cannot track, and when coherence is allowed to remain undisturbed, reality reorganizes without instruction. This is the law. Not by forcing, but by allowing. Not by chasing, but by staying. If you leave this moment exactly as you entered it, nothing changes. If you stay just a little longer without trying to extract something from it, the shift completes itself. That is how subtle this is. That is why it matters. If you feel the quiet recognition beginning to form, do not rush away from it. Stay within this frequency. Subscribe, and remain here long enough for awareness to catch up to what has already begun. The shift never begins where you were taught to look. It does not start as a thought, a decision, or a sudden realization that announces itself clearly. It begins lower, quieter, and earlier than the mind. Before you can name it, before you can explain it, something in the body softens, something in the emotional field loosens, and coherence begins to form without asking for permission. This is why so many people miss it. They are trained to wait for understanding before they trust an experience. They assume clarity must come first, and only then can something be real. But alignment does not wait for interpretation. The nervous system registers safety, openness, and resonance long before the mind assembles a story around it. By the time thought arrives, the shift has either been allowed to deepen or quietly abandoned. You may recognize this as a subtle sense of expansion, a calm without cause, a feeling that nothing needs to be fixed in that moment. It is not excitement. It is not motivation. It is not certainty. It is a quiet internal, yes, that does not use words. This is how timelines signal availability. Not with urgency, but with ease. The problem is not that people feel this and reject it. The problem is that they feel it and delay. They wait to understand what it means, where it is going, or what they should do next. In that waiting, attention drifts back to the familiar patterns that feel productive, responsible, or necessary. The body had already opened the door, but the mind never noticed it was standing in the doorway. Delay is subtle. It looks harmless. It feels like caution, intelligence, or discernment. In reality, it is how coherence dissolves. Alignment requires no action, but it does require presence. When presence is replaced with analysis, the nervous system returns to its baseline, and the old timeline resumes without conflict. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no sense of loss. The moment simply passes. This is why trying to understand a shift while it is happening is often what prevents it from completing. The mind wants definition. The field responds to state. While the mind asks questions, the body is already answering. When the answers are ignored long enough, the questions become irrelevant. There is a precision to this that is rarely acknowledged. Reality does not wait for certainty. It responds to coherence the instant it appears. When coherence is interrupted, the response pauses. Not as punishment. Not as consequence. Simply as feedback. The field mirrors what is being held, and when attention moves away, the mirror clears. You are not meant to chase these moments or try to recreate them. You are meant to notice them while they are here. The sensation of quiet expansion is not something to capture. It is something to allow. The less you reach for it, the more stable it becomes. The more you try to understand it, the faster it slips away. This changes how you listen to yourself. Instead of asking what you think, you begin to notice what has already settled. Instead of waiting for clarity, you stay with coherence. That is how the shift completes itself, not through knowledge, but through recognition that arrives only when you stop demanding it. Nothing has gone wrong if you have missed moments like this before. This is how learning occurs. Awareness lags at first. The important part is realizing where to look now, not in thought, not in explanation, but in the quiet signals that arrive before you know what they are. This moment is easy to lose because attention has momentum, and momentum does not ask permission. Attention follows what it has been trained to follow, and most training happens unconsciously. Even when alignment briefly appears, attention is already leaning elsewhere, ready to return to what is familiar, loud, and demanding. The shift does not require interruption to disappear. It only requires neglect. Attention is the currency of experience, and whatever is not attended to stops being lived, even if it remains available. When attention drifts, the new timeline does not collapse. It simply goes unoccupied. Reality continues to offer it, but experience defaults to wherever attention lands next. Noise plays a major role here, not just external noise, but informational noise. Notifications, internal commentary, unfinished thoughts, imagined obligations, all of it competes for focus. None of these need to be intense to be effective. They only need to be familiar. Attention returns to them automatically because they already have established pathways. The new moment has no such infrastructure yet. It is fragile not because it is weak, but because it is new. Urgency is another powerful pull. Urgency compresses attention, narrowing it toward perceived problems or next steps. Even when nothing is actually required, urgency can appear out of habit, creating the sense that something must be done immediately. In that compression, subtle coherence cannot be felt. Attention moves away not because the moment lacked value, but because urgency felt more important. Mental looping completes the cycle. A thought repeats, then another, not because they are useful, but because repetition gives the illusion of control. Attention circles familiar mental territory while the present moment remains unattended. This is how the old timeline reasserts itself without resistance or decision. Nothing forces the return. Attention simply never stayed. It is important to understand that the shift is not stolen from you. It is not revoked. It is not fragile in the way people assume. It remains intact, but uninhabited. Like a room you briefly entered and then walked out of, it does not vanish because you left. It simply no longer defines your experience. This is why effort does not help here. Effort adds more activity to the attentional field, more things to track, more pressure to manage. The more attention is scattered, the less it can remain with what is subtle. Staying is not something you do. It is something you stop undoing. Most people believe missing moments like this means they failed to act. In reality, they acted too quickly. Attention rushed ahead of experience, chasing relevance, meaning, or utility. The present moment was treated as a bridge instead of a destination. When attention moves away, experience follows. Nothing needs to be fixed to prevent this. Awareness alone changes how attention behaves. When you see how easily attention is pulled, you stop blaming yourself for the pull and stop obeying it automatically. You notice the impulse to move on without needing to follow it. This moment remains available as long as attention is allowed to rest where it is. Not held tightly. Not monitored. Simply inhabited. The shift does not demand vigilance. It requires only that you stop leaving before you have arrived. What follows is not a belief system and not a philosophy to agree or disagree with. It is a description of how reality responds in practice, regardless of what anyone thinks about it. Emotion is not a byproduct of experience. Emotion is the instruction that experience responds to. It operates automatically, without effort, without intention, and without conscious direction, and it does so long before thought gets involved. Emotion is a state of coherence or incoherence in the system. When coherence is present, reality organizes smoothly. When incoherence dominates, reality fragments and repeats. This happens without judgment and without delay. The field does not wait for you to decide what you want. It responds to what you are broadcasting emotionally, moment by moment, because emotion is information, and information is directive. This is why trying to think your way into a different reality is so ineffective. Thought does not initiate creation. Thought interprets what emotion has already selected. By the time a thought appears, a direction has already been set. The mind then builds a story around that direction and mistakes the story for the cause. In reality, the cause came first, quietly, emotionally, automatically. You can see this clearly when you notice how quickly circumstances match your emotional baseline without any planning. When you feel open, supported, or internally settled, things align without effort. When you feel contracted, rushed, or resistant, obstacles appear without invitation. This is not coincidence and not punishment. It is responsiveness. The field mirrors the dominant signal, not the narrative about it. Emotion does not need to be intense to be effective. In fact, the most powerful emotional signals are often subtle and steady. A quiet sense of safety will outinstruct a burst of excitement. A calm expectation will override 1,000 affirmations spoken from tension. The system responds to consistency, not volume. This is why forcing positivity fails and allowing coherence works. Understanding this removes a great deal of unnecessary struggle. You do not need to manage every thought or control every reaction. You only need to recognize what state you are inhabiting. When the emotional field settles, selection happens automatically. When it is disturbed, selection shifts just as easily. No effort is required either way. This also explains why awareness alone does not change outcomes if emotional state remains the same. You can know exactly what is happening and still repeat the same timeline if the underlying signal does not change. Reality does not respond to awareness. It responds to alignment. Awareness simply allows alignment to be noticed and therefore allowed. If this recognition is landing for you, take a moment to like the video. That action is not about approval. It is a way of reinforcing the coherence that is already present, a small but clear signal that you are recognizing what is being described rather than just thinking about it. Once you see emotion as a selector instead of a reaction, responsibility changes shape. There is nothing to force and nothing to chase. You stop asking how to make things happen and begin noticing what state you are already in. From there, reality adjusts on its own. This is the mechanism. It has always been working. The only difference now is that you are seeing it. Thought has been given a role it never actually held. You were taught that if you think clearly enough, plan carefully enough, or repeat the right affirmations long enough, reality will eventually comply. This belief feels empowering on the surface, but it quietly creates pressure underneath. It places responsibility in the wrong place and then blames the mind when nothing changes. Thought does not initiate creation. It arrives after selection has already occurred. It explains, justifies, narrates, and rationalizes what the emotional field has set in motion. By the time a thought forms, the direction is already chosen. The mind then claims authorship, not out of malice, but out of habit. You can see this if you watch how thoughts behave during different emotional states. When you are calm and internally settled, your thoughts sound reasonable, optimistic, and spacious. When you are contracted or restless, your thoughts sound urgent, doubtful, or defensive. The content changes, but the function does not. Thought always follows state. It never leads it. This is why thinking harder so often leads to exhaustion rather than change. The mind keeps trying to solve a problem that was never cognitive. It keeps rearranging explanations while the underlying signal remains the same. When nothing shifts, self-blame appears. You assume you did not think correctly, believe strongly enough, or stay consistent long enough. In reality, the system was never waiting for thought in the first place. Understanding this removes a subtle but constant strain. You no longer need to monitor every idea or correct every mental fluctuation. Thoughts are not commands. They are commentary. They tell you what state you are inhabiting, not what you are creating. Once this is seen, discernment sharpens naturally. You stop arguing with the narrator and start listening to what it reveals. This also explains why affirmations spoken from tension rarely work. The words may be positive, but the emotional signal underneath contradicts them. The field responds to the signal, not the sentence. Thought tries to override emotion, but emotion has already instructed the field. No amount of repetition changes that. Only a shift in state does, and that shift is not achieved through argument. When thought is placed back in its proper role, it becomes useful again. It can reflect, integrate, and articulate what is happening instead of trying to force what should happen. It becomes a translator instead of a driver. This is where clarity emerges without effort. You understand more because you are no longer trying to manufacture understanding. This reframing also dissolves pressure around timing and performance. There is nothing you are supposed to think your way into. There is no mental posture you must maintain to deserve a different experience. Reality does not test your discipline. It mirrors your coherence. Thought simply keeps score. When you stop using thought as a tool for control, it quiets on its own. Not because you silenced it, but because it no longer has a job it cannot perform. In that quiet, recognition deepens. You begin to sense when a direction has already been chosen without needing to justify it mentally. This is not about rejecting thought or making it wrong. It is about releasing it from a responsibility it never carried. Once you do, effort softens, blame dissolves, and reality responds more fluidly. Not because you thought better, but because you stopped mistaking the explanation for the cause. Most people try to act because they have been trained to equate movement with value. From an early age, stillness is interpreted as delay, and noticing is mistaken for doing nothing. Productivity becomes a moral signal, and effort becomes proof that something is happening. In that conditioning, subtle alignment is overridden before it has a chance to stabilize. When coherence appears, it does not ask for action. It asks for space. But the reflex to act is fast, automatic, and deeply ingrained. The moment something feels different, the mind looks for a task, a step, or a decision to justify the feeling. Action is taken not because it is needed, but because it feels familiar. In that familiarity, alignment is replaced with motion. This is where many timelines quietly collapse. Not because action is wrong, but because it is premature. Action taken from habit interrupts the state that made the new direction available in the first place. The body had already aligned. Attention had already settled. Then the reflex to do something pulled everything back into the old pattern of effort and management. Action, when it is aligned, emerges naturally. It does not feel urgent. It does not feel forced. It does not come with pressure to make something happen. It arises as an extension of coherence, not a reaction to it. Premature action, on the other hand, is fueled by discomfort with stillness. It is an attempt to regain control rather than a response to clarity. This distinction is subtle but decisive. When action is a reflex, it carries tension. It seeks results. It wants confirmation. When action is a response, it feels obvious, almost secondary. The difference is not visible from the outside. It is felt internally as either contraction or ease. Most people are not trained to recognize this difference, so they act at the first sign of change and wonder why nothing holds. The timeline does not punish premature action. It simply mirrors the state behind it. If the action comes from urgency, the field responds with more urgency. If it comes from control, resistance appears. The original coherence is not lost, it is just no longer being inhabited. Attention has moved from noticing to managing, and the system follows attention. Learning to notice instead of act does not mean becoming passive. It means allowing the internal state to finish organizing itself before translating into movement. Stillness is not delay. It is calibration. When calibration is skipped, movement lacks direction, even if it looks productive. This is why so many people stay busy without going anywhere. Action becomes a way to avoid feeling the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. But not knowing is often the doorway. Clarity does not arrive through acceleration. It arrives through allowing the signal to complete itself. If you recognize this reflex in yourself, pause with it. You do not need to correct it immediately. Awareness softens it on its own. When you see how quickly you move to act, you regain the option to stay instead. That option changes everything. If this realization is landing for you, take a moment to comment. Let the declaration itself anchor the noticing, not as analysis, but as recognition of a pattern that no longer needs to run automatically. Desire points toward change, but identity determines what repeats. This is where many shifts lose momentum without resistance or failure. Desire is directional. Identity is gravitational. Desire says where you want to go. Identity decides where you remain. When the two are misaligned, identity always wins, quietly and automatically. Identity is not a concept you think about. It is a pattern the system recognizes as familiar. It is how you expect yourself to feel, respond, and exist from moment to moment. It operates beneath intention. You can want something deeply and still return to the same experiences because identity does not respond to wanting. It responds to what feels like me. This is why change often feels temporary. A new desire appears, a moment of alignment opens, and something begins to shift. Then, without effort, the familiar self reasserts itself. Not because the desire was weak, but because identity remained unchanged. The system defaults to what it knows how to maintain. Familiar emotional baselines, familiar reactions, familiar expectations quietly take over again. Identity momentum is subtle. It does not argue with you. It does not announce itself. It simply resumes. You find yourself thinking the same thoughts, responding in the same ways, interpreting events through the same lens. The shift did not fail. It was outpaced by repetition. What you return to repeatedly becomes stable, regardless of what you desire. This is also why forcing change at the level of behavior rarely holds. Behavior is downstream from identity. You can act differently for a while, but if the underlying sense of self remains the same, the system will correct back to equilibrium. This correction is not sabotage. It is coherence. The system seeks internal consistency, not improvement. Awareness is the only thing that interrupts this momentum. Not effort. Not discipline. Awareness allows identity to be seen as a pattern rather than a truth. When identity is unseen, it runs automatically. When it is noticed, it loosens. This noticing does not require judgment or replacement. It requires recognition. Most people try to change who they are by chasing who they want to become. That chase reinforces the current identity as incomplete, behind, or not enough. The field responds accordingly. Identity does not shift through aspiration. It shifts through inhabitation. You become what you repeatedly occupy emotionally and attentively. This is why moments of coherence matter so much. They offer a temporary suspension of identity momentum. For a brief window, the familiar self is quiet. If that quiet is allowed to remain, identity reorganizes naturally. If attention returns quickly to the old reference points, the system locks back into what it knows. Nothing has gone wrong when this happens. Identity has simply done its job. The key is understanding that desire alone is not the lever. Presence is. The more consistently you inhabit a different state, the less effort identity requires to maintain it. Eventually, the new state becomes the familiar one. This is not about becoming someone else. It is about releasing allegiance to a version of yourself that no longer matches your direction. Identity does not need to be destroyed or fought. It needs to be outgrown through sustained recognition. When awareness stays with what is already shifting, identity follows. The body decides what is real long before the mind forms an opinion. This is not metaphorical. The nervous system is constantly assessing safety, familiarity, and coherence, and whatever it recognizes as stable becomes the ground reality organizes itself around. Timelines do not stabilize because they make sense. They stabilize because the body can hold them. Every nervous system has an emotional baseline, a range of sensations that feel normal, predictable, and therefore real. Experiences that fall within that range are accepted without question. Experiences outside of it may feel interesting, hopeful, or even expansive, yet still be interpreted as temporary or unreal. This is how new timelines are often released without conflict. The body simply does not register them as home yet. When coherence appears, it can feel strangely unfamiliar. Calm may feel suspicious. Ease may feel undeserved. Stability may feel like something that will not last. None of this is fear in the dramatic sense. It is calibration. The nervous system is comparing the present state to its stored reference points and noticing a mismatch. Until that mismatch resolves, the old timeline remains the default. This explains why people often return to familiar experiences even when better options are available. The return is not driven by self-sabotage or resistance. It is driven by regulation. The body moves toward what it knows how to sustain. If a new state cannot yet be held without tension, the system gently guides experience back to what feels manageable. There is no mistake in this process. It is intelligent. The nervous system prioritizes stability over improvement. It chooses coherence over aspiration. When a new timeline feels unstable at the bodily level, the system does not argue with it. It simply disengages. Attention shifts. Old patterns resume. The shift remains possible, but it is no longer inhabited. This is why forcing yourself to stay positive or hold the new state rarely works. Pressure adds activation. Activation signals threat. The nervous system responds by tightening, not opening. The more you try to convince yourself that something is safe, the more the body senses that it might not be. Safety cannot be argued into existence. It must be felt. Familiarity plays a powerful role here. What is familiar feels real even when it is uncomfortable. What is unfamiliar can feel unreal even when it is expansive. This is not a flaw. It is how learning occurs. Repeated exposure without pressure allows the nervous system to update its reference points. Over time, what once felt strange becomes neutral. What felt neutral becomes comfortable. What felt comfortable becomes home. This is why gentle consistency matters more than intensity. A small amount of coherence held repeatedly does more than a dramatic shift that cannot be sustained. The nervous system learns through repetition, not persuasion. When it learns that a new state can be held without effort, it begins to treat that state as real. Understanding this removes another layer of self-judgment. When a shift fades, it does not mean you were not ready or not aligned enough. It means the body had not yet integrated the experience. Integration cannot be rushed. It happens through patience and presence, not through demand. As the nervous system adapts, reality follows. External circumstances reorganize as internal baselines change. This is not something you make happen. It is something you allow by staying with what is emerging long enough for the body to recognize it as safe. Once that recognition occurs, the timeline no longer feels new. It feels normal. And what feels normal becomes real. Time has been given credit for delays it never caused. People assume that change requires waiting, preparation, or the right sequence of events, when in reality nothing was missing except attention. Time does not unlock timelines. Awareness does. And awareness only ever exists now. The belief in waiting is comforting because it removes responsibility from the present moment. If something is supposed to happen later, then nothing needs to be recognized now. Preparation becomes a substitute for presence. Planning becomes a way to postpone inhabiting what is already available. This is not wrong, but it is unnecessary. Creation does not cue itself in the future. It responds immediately to where awareness is placed. Nothing meaningful is created in anticipation. Nothing stabilizes in memory. The field responds only to what is being inhabited, not to what is hoped for or reviewed. When awareness is fully present, reality reorganizes without delay. When awareness drifts, nothing progresses, no matter how much time passes. This is why long periods of waiting often produce no movement, while a single moment of clarity can change everything. The difference is not duration. It is location. Awareness was finally placed where creation happens. Not in thought, not in strategy, not in rehearsal, but in direct experience. Preparation is often misunderstood here. True preparation is not gathering information or refining plans. It is clearing attention. It is removing distractions long enough for awareness to settle into what is actually happening. Most people prepare endlessly because they never arrive. Attention keeps moving forward or backward, imagining readiness instead of inhabiting it. Timing is another illusion built on the same misunderstanding. People wait for signs that the moment is right, assuming the future will announce itself more clearly than the present. In reality, the only signal that matters is coherence. When coherence is present, timing is correct. When it is absent, no amount of waiting will produce alignment. Delays feel real because attention feels busy. The mind stays occupied, evaluating progress, measuring distance, tracking time. Meanwhile, awareness is never placed fully anywhere. Creation cannot respond to a moving target. It responds to stillness, not because stillness is passive, but because it is precise. This does not mean that things must happen instantly or dramatically. It means that the direction is set instantly. Once awareness inhabits a state, momentum begins. The visible expression may unfold gradually, but the selection happens immediately. Time is simply how that selection reveals itself, not how it is chosen. When people say they are stuck, what they usually mean is that attention is split. Part of it remains in the familiar, part of it imagines something else, and neither is fully inhabited. The system reflects that division as stagnation. Not because nothing is possible, but because nothing is being lived. Understanding this removes the pressure to rush and the temptation to delay. There is nothing to catch up to and nothing to wait for. There is only the option to be where you are, fully enough that reality can respond. When awareness settles, the sense of waiting dissolves on its own. Time was never holding anything back. It was simply filling the space while attention looked elsewhere. The moment awareness returns, creation resumes, not as effort, not as force, but as a natural consequence of being present where reality actually moves. The assumption that something must be held together is what introduces strain. The moment you believe a shift requires maintenance, vigilance, or discipline, tension enters the system. That tension is not neutral. It signals interference. The shift does not need to be protected. It needs to be left alone. Stabilization has been misunderstood as effort because effort is familiar. Doing feels safer than not doing. Monitoring feels responsible. Checking feels necessary. Yet every one of these actions pulls attention out of coherence and back into control. The system responds immediately, not with punishment, but with recalibration. The state changes because the signal changed. You do not hold a shift in place. Holding implies resistance against collapse. There is nothing collapsing. The shift remains as long as it is not interrupted by management. The moment you begin watching it, measuring it, or worrying about losing it, attention moves from inhabiting to guarding. Guarding is a different state, and the field mirrors that state instead. This is subtle and counterintuitive. The mind wants reassurance that things are stable. It wants to check progress, confirm outcomes, and ensure continuity. But stability does not come from reassurance. It comes from absence of disturbance. A calm system does not ask if it is calm. It simply is. Discipline often gets confused with consistency here. Discipline implies force applied against resistance. Consistency emerges when there is no resistance to begin with. When coherence feels natural, no discipline is required to remain there. When discipline is needed, it is a sign that interference is already present. Maintenance creates the same problem. Maintenance assumes decay. It assumes that without effort, things will fall apart. This assumption itself becomes the signal the field responds to. The experience begins to reflect fragility because fragility is being projected. The shift did not weaken. The interpretation did. Vigilance is the most deceptive form of interruption because it looks like care. In reality, vigilance is fear disguised as responsibility. It keeps attention slightly contracted, slightly alert, slightly braced. That subtle brace is enough to change the state. The nervous system senses that something might go wrong, and reality responds by reintroducing instability. Non-interference is not negligence. It is trust in the mechanics that brought the shift into being in the first place. If coherence emerged without effort, it does not require effort to remain. The same law applies. The same responsiveness holds. This does not mean you ignore life or disengage from action. It means action arises from the state rather than being imposed on it. When action is needed, it feels obvious and clean. When it is not needed, stillness does not feel like waiting. It feels complete. Most people interrupt shifts because they are afraid of losing something good. That fear becomes the interruption. The irony is precise. What you try to secure is what you destabilize. What you allow remains. When you stop interfering, there is a noticeable softening. Attention settles. The urge to manage fades. Experience becomes self-sustaining. Not because you did something right, but because you stopped doing something unnecessary. The shift does not ask to be held. It asks to be trusted. When you trust it by leaving it undisturbed, it stabilizes on its own. This is not passive. It is accurate. Calm is not the absence of movement. It is the absence of resistance. This distinction matters because calm has been misunderstood as passivity, as waiting, or as doing nothing. In reality, calm is an active signal. It communicates completion to the field. It says, without words, that nothing is missing and nothing needs to be corrected. When calm is present, the system stops searching. Searching is what keeps probability open. Searching implies uncertainty. Calm closes the loop. It tells reality that a selection has already been made. This is why calm collapses probability into form without effort. The field does not respond to urgency. It responds to resolution. Urgency keeps possibilities spinning. Calm stabilizes one. When you are calm, you are no longer asking what will happen or how it will happen. You are inhabiting a state where the question has dissolved. This inhabitation is what the field mirrors. Not the desire, not the intention, but the settled knowing beneath both. Calm does not feel exciting, which is why it is often overlooked. Excitement contains movement toward something. Calm contains arrival. Many people mistake excitement for alignment and calm for stagnation. The field makes no such mistake. It recognizes calm as coherence and responds accordingly. This is why moments of true alignment often feel ordinary. Nothing seems to be happening. There is no internal commentary pushing forward or pulling back. The system is at rest, and rest is not neutral. Rest is a signal that the work is complete. When the system rests, reality reorganizes around that rest. Calm also differs from suppression. Suppression requires effort. Calm requires none. Suppression tightens. Calm opens. If calm feels forced, it is not calm. If it needs to be maintained, it is not calm. Real calm is effortless because it emerges naturally when interference stops. The field responds to this immediately. Not always visibly, but structurally. Probability narrows. Opportunities align. Resistance dissolves. None of this requires attention or monitoring. In fact, monitoring disrupts the very signal calm is sending. Calm does not watch itself. It simply exists. This is why trying to be calm rarely works. Trying is an admission of lack. Calm cannot be achieved. It can only be allowed. It appears when control is released, when vigilance softens, when the need to manage outcomes fades. In that release, the system communicates safety and completion. Completion is the key here. Calm tells the field that the selection process is over. There is no more oscillation between options. There is no more checking or comparing. The system has settled. The field mirrors that settlement by bringing form into alignment. This does not mean nothing happens. It means what happens does not feel like struggle. Movement arises without friction. Action emerges without urgency. Decisions feel obvious rather than pressured. Calm does not slow life down. It removes drag. Most people believe they must wait for external confirmation before they can be calm. In reality, calm is the confirmation. When you allow calm to be present without questioning it, you are signaling that the shift is complete. The field hears this clearly. Calm is not the end of the process. It is the point where the process no longer needs you. From there, reality does what it does best. It responds. Reality rarely rearranges itself with spectacle. When coherence stabilizes, the response is subtle, progressive, and easy to overlook if you are expecting confirmation to arrive loudly. This is deliberate. Loud change invites monitoring. Quiet change invites inhabitation. The field responds in a way that does not pull attention back into control. External shifts begin as small deviations from the familiar. Conversations flow differently. Obstacles dissolve without effort. Timing aligns without explanation. None of this announces itself as a result. It simply feels less resistant than before. If you are not looking for proof, you notice ease. If you are looking for proof, you notice nothing at all. This is where many people interrupt the process without realizing it. They begin to check. They look for signs that something is happening. They measure progress against expectations. The moment monitoring begins, attention leaves coherence and returns to evaluation. Evaluation changes the signal. The field responds accordingly, not by taking anything away, but by pausing the rearrangement. Reality reflects state, not desire. When coherence is present, reflection happens naturally. When attention turns toward outcome, coherence is replaced with anticipation. Anticipation keeps probability open. The response slows because the signal has changed. Nothing is wrong. The system is simply precise. Subtle rearrangement is intentional because it allows integration. Large, dramatic shifts can overwhelm the nervous system and trigger recalibration back to the familiar. Quiet changes slip past resistance. They allow the body and attention to adapt without strain. Over time, these small changes compound, and the landscape looks different without any single moment marking the transition. This is why patience without waiting is essential. Patience here does not mean hoping or enduring. It means not interfering. It means allowing reality to respond at the pace that coherence can be held. The urge to rush outcomes is a return to control. Control reintroduces tension. Tension disrupts the signal. You may notice that when things begin to align, you feel less inclined to talk about it. Less inclined to explain or justify what is happening. This is not secrecy. It is stability. The system does not seek validation when it is settled. Sharing too early often reactivates monitoring, both internally and externally. The field does not reward observation. It responds to occupation. When you occupy coherence, reality rearranges around it. When you observe the rearrangement, attention shifts away from occupation. This is why outcomes accelerate when you stop watching them. None of this requires blindness or denial. You are allowed to notice changes. The difference is whether noticing turns into measuring. Measuring asks, is this enough? Noticing simply registers what is present and returns to inhabiting the state that allowed it. Progress here is not linear. It is cumulative. Each moment of non-interference allows the field to continue organizing. Each moment of monitoring pauses that organization. Over time, the balance shifts toward ease, not because you forced it, but because you stopped interrupting it. Reality does not need to be managed into place. It responds more intelligently than the mind can plan. When you allow rearrangement to happen quietly, you discover that what arrives feels inevitable rather than earned. It feels normal rather than miraculous. This is the signature of true alignment. Life does not look dramatically different all at once. It feels increasingly unresistant. And by the time you realize how much has changed, the need to track it is already gone. At a certain point, the idea that you are the one shifting timelines begins to dissolve on its own. Not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. It places you inside a process that is actually appearing within you. The seeker identity assumes effort, movement, progression from one state to another. What becomes clear here is that nothing is moving the way the mind imagines. Timelines are not places you travel to. They are patterns that arise and dissolve within awareness itself. You are not a character navigating reality from the outside. You are the field in which reality organizes itself. When this is recognized, the pressure to do something about your experience softens. The sense of responsibility shifts from management to recognition. Nothing needs to be pushed forward because nothing was behind to begin with. The feeling of being someone who must change, improve, or arrive somewhere else is part of the same structure that creates delay. It assumes separation between where you are and where you should be. That separation exists only as an idea. Awareness has never been confined to a single outcome. It has always contained every version simultaneously, selecting through coherence without effort. When you see this, the entire framework of seeking loosens. You stop scanning your experience for evidence of progress. You stop evaluating whether you are doing it right. These behaviors belong to the identity that believes it is inside the system trying to influence it. Awareness does not try. It notices. And what is noticed organizes itself accordingly. Timelines arise as patterns of experience, then dissolve when attention moves. None of this requires a central operator. There is no controller behind the scenes making decisions. There is only responsiveness. Awareness responds to what it inhabits, and reality reflects that inhabitation. The idea of you shifting something implies effort where none is required. This does not make you passive. It makes you accurate. Action still occurs, decisions still happen, movement still unfolds, but without the weight of authorship. Life moves through you rather than being managed by you. When this is felt, even briefly, there is a noticeable relief. The constant sense of needing to get somewhere relaxes because it was never necessary. The seeker identity thrives on distance. It needs a future version to pursue and a present version to improve. Awareness has no such structure. It is already complete. From this completeness, experience reorganizes naturally. Not because awareness wants something, but because coherence is its nature. This is why recognition is more powerful than effort. Effort assumes lack. Recognition dissolves it. When you recognize yourself as the space in which experience happens, timelines lose their grip as objects to chase. They become expressions that pass through, leaving behind shifts without struggle. Nothing about this needs to be held or remembered. Awareness does not need reminders of itself. It only needs the absence of distraction long enough for this to be seen. Once seen, the urgency to become something else fades. What remains is presence, and presence has always been the creative force. You were never meant to shift timelines as a person. You were meant to notice that timelines shift as a function of what you are. When that is recognized, the entire process becomes lighter, quieter, and far more effective, not because you are doing more, but because you are no longer in the way. Missing a shift has been framed as failure for so long that the idea feels unquestionable. If something did not change, if momentum faded, if life returned to what was familiar, the assumption is that something went wrong. That assumption is the only thing that needs to be released here. Nothing was failed. Nothing was lost. What occurred was non-recognition, and non-recognition carries no penalty. A shift does not disappear because it was mishandled. It simply stops being inhabited when it is not recognized. There is no judgment in this process. The field does not keep score. It does not measure worthiness, readiness, or effort. It responds to presence. When presence is there, momentum forms. When presence moves elsewhere, momentum follows it just as easily. This is why fear around missing moments is unnecessary. Fear implies scarcity. Scarcity implies that opportunities are rare, fragile, and easily taken away. That is not how reality functions. Timelines are not prizes to be won. They are expressions that become available whenever coherence forms. Availability is constant. Recognition is what fluctuates. When people believe they have failed, they often tighten. They try harder. They attempt to correct themselves or make up for lost time. This tightening creates the very state that prevents recognition from occurring again. The irony is precise. Self-judgment feels like responsibility, but it is actually distraction. Attention turns toward the story of failure instead of returning to the present moment where recognition happens. Momentum does not follow effort. It follows clarity. And clarity is not something you earn. It is something that appears when attention is no longer fragmented by regret or anticipation. The moment you stop measuring yourself against an imagined outcome, awareness naturally settles. From that settlement, alignment becomes possible again. Nothing about missing a shift changes your access to the next one. There is no memory in the field that marks you as someone who missed your chance. Each moment stands on its own. Each moment contains its own availability. Carrying the past forward is a mental habit, not a cosmic rule. This reframing removes urgency without removing importance. It allows you to take this moment seriously without turning it into pressure. Recognition cannot be forced by fear. It arrives when fear is no longer needed. When you understand that nothing is at risk, the system relaxes. In that relaxation, coherence forms more easily. Effort has been overvalued because it looks like engagement. In reality, effort often signals misalignment. Recognition is quieter. It does not announce itself with intensity. It feels like a simple noticing that something is already different. From there, momentum builds naturally, without strain. There is no need to review past moments to see where you went wrong. There is no benefit in replaying decisions or analyzing missed signals. Awareness does not move backward to correct itself. It returns to now. Every return is sufficient. Every return is complete. When you stop treating missed shifts as mistakes, the entire process becomes lighter. You become more available, not less. Attention stops guarding against failure and starts resting where it is. That rest is not passive. It is receptive. And receptivity is what allows recognition to occur. Nothing is being withheld from you. Nothing needs to be earned back. The only difference between momentum and stagnation is where awareness is placed. When it returns to the present without judgment, the system responds immediately. Not because you deserved it, but because recognition has always been enough. This moment has not expired. It did not pass while you were listening. It did not close because time moved forward. What opened earlier is still open now, because it was never about time in the first place. It was about presence. And presence does not belong to the past. The resonance that brought you here was not a single event. It was a state. States do not vanish when they are not used immediately. They wait. They remain available until attention either inhabits them or moves elsewhere. Nothing has been lost by arriving here slowly. Nothing has been damaged by hesitation. This moment is still live because awareness is still here. Urgency is no longer required. Pressure would only distort what is already forming. The shift does not complete through intensity. It completes through recognition that nothing more needs to be added. When recognition settles, the system stabilizes naturally, without effort, without reinforcement, without supervision. This is the part most people never reach. They think the moment matters only if something dramatic happens inside it. When nothing explodes, they assume nothing occurred. In reality, the absence of drama is the sign that coherence has replaced striving. The field responds most clearly when it is not being watched. You are not being asked to decide anything right now. Decisions belong to the mind. Recognition belongs to awareness. Awareness simply notices that it is no longer reaching, no longer waiting, no longer preparing. It notices that it is already here. From that noticing, reality reorganizes without instruction. If you feel a sense of quiet completion rather than excitement, that is not a lack of response. That is the response. Calm does not mean nothing happened. Calm means the selection has already been made. The system rests when movement is finished. From rest, form emerges. There is no next technique. No next correction. No next step to remember. The only thing that matters now is not leaving prematurely. Not because something will be taken away, but because leaving returns attention to noise. Staying allows the state to integrate. Integration is how timelines become lived realities rather than brief experiences. You do not need to hold on to this moment. Holding would imply fear of loss. Loss is not part of this mechanism. You only need to stop interrupting what is already stable. When you do that, life responds in ways that feel inevitable rather than earned. This is how shifts actually complete. Quietly. Naturally. Without announcement. If this recognition is present, let it remain uncomplicated. Stay within this frequency. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it.